With the conclusion of Dragon Ball Super Episode 102, some unusual things have happened. A complete shift in the show's theme and tone, and the abilities of Android 17 rising above the competition. But to dive deeper into this video, alrighty guys, it is Quaman here today, also known as Detective Q, and I'll be bringing you a good and bad breakdown of Dragon Ball Super Episode 102. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into this video. So, starting off with the good, one thing I think that happened in the beginning of the episode to really prepare us for what was going to happen is the fact that we see a scene in which Zeno is actually updating the Tournament of Power on his God Pad as you're seeing all of the different fighters throughout all of the universes and all of the dark spots, and it is here where we officially see the first instance of the Universe 6 namekians on Universe 6's team, which is what I found really interesting, and we also got a chance to relook at some of the missing characters that we've been looking forward to in the Tournament of Power. So that was a great way to refresh our minds about who's actually participating. And when we go on to some of the positive elements about the Magical Girl sequence, there were quite a few things to actually like about it. I did like the humor and the entire inside joke that the whole episode was based around this whole Magical Girls theme while nobody can do anything while they're transforming, and the fact that it was a big inside joke that Toei has done because they have so many Magical Girl themes in Japan. So to me, I thought that was a very interesting way to add it for the episode, as I already did an explanation video on what that joke was about. And if I were to add something else here, it did kind of take me off guard that Android 17 was the one to disrupt that sequence. The thing to me is, in this Tournament of Power, Android 17 is probably the most wildcard character, and if I were to guess there was somebody who would interrupt the actual transformation sequence, I would think it was Vegeta because of his distaste in such corny behavior, and the fact that Vegeta has that type of rude personality that he would do something like that. So it was interesting to see that 17 was getting into the fray. And the fact that Topo from Universe 11 was the one who was actually scolding 17 for interrupting him made this a much more interesting sequence, because Universe 2 and Universe 11 are twin universes, so it was sort of like a Universe 2 Universe 11 connection while we see Topo scolding 17. And when we talk more about the atmosphere, I think what adds more towards this episode having a completely different tone and theme is the heart-like background. So we see throughout the episode that there was pink smoke in the Tournament of Power, and we also saw all of those hearts flying around, and although that's very girly and feminine for a lot of Dragon Ball fans to look at, I do think it was a good way to at least change the atmosphere if you're going to change the whole episode theme in general, and it really made me feel like you're playing one of those video games and fighting against a boss, and the boss completely manipulates the area to their own liking, and that's kind of how I got a feel for these three Magical Girl characters from Universe 2. But when we move on to the actual fighting, guys, there is one scene that I really have to mention here dealing with Vegeta. So, as 17, Goku, and Vegeta are fighting against Ribrianne and her crew, there was one scene where we see Vegeta fighting against Ribrianne and she's rolling around on the ground after she had transformed, and you see it turning into slow motion as Ribrianne's coming towards Vegeta, and Vegeta's facial expression completely twists and his mouth gets so nasty and he just jumps away. And the interesting thing about all of this is that you really got a chance to feel Vegeta's personality in this moment as he's watching Ribrianne doing something that he considers disgusting, and how he feels so awkward fighting against a character like that. So that was a very interesting moment for Vegeta, and definitely one of the humorous highlights of this episode. And when we move on to the other fighters, I think there's some interesting contrasts here. We see that Rozie has this interesting ability called the Yachaina Fist, in which her fists and punches tend to get much more powerful. And when we also couple this with Kakunsa, I think Kakunsa really added the most unique, I guess you could say, personality of Ribrianne's crew, because she's the most animalistic out of all of them. But when we see that 17 starts retaliating in this episode, it really brought it up in terms of, I guess you could say, awe factor, as 17 catches Kakunsa with his barrier. And the interesting thing about all of this is that while 17 is dominating Kakunsa with his barrier, there was a scene where he knocks her away, and Recall, another member from Universe 2, comes in to catch Kakunsa and actually saves her from the Tournament of Power. And for the first time in this entire battle, We finally got a sequence in which a flying character did something useful with their actual wings instead of making flying a complete joke in this Tournament of Power. And last but not least, guys, if I were to conclude what I thought was good about this episode, it would have to be that after 17 finishes off Kakunsa, we see a complete shift in tone. So this was a very girly, happy, optimistic episode in terms of what the Universe 2 fighters were, but we see at the end that after Kakunsa loses, Ribrianne gets very angry, she rages out, and we see that her and 17 are about to have a big battle in the upcoming episode. And I think that this is now showing that Dragon Ball Super is going to shift its tone once again, where we're going to go from this happy, heart-filled episode to a much more angry, revenge type episode coming up in the future. And I do think it's interesting to see Super switching up how the episode is going into another direction in the next. But guys, as you guys would have expected, this was not a perfect episode, and I do have some things to talk about the bad. So the first thing we have to talk about is this episode being stretched out. So, as I've said before, I understand that the point of the episode was to reuse animation and to make an entire joke to Dragon Ball fans what the magical girl genre is like, and merging the magical genre with the Dragon Ball series. And also to show how silly Dragon Ball is at times, where characters just have all of these long power-ups while nobody does anything about it. I enjoyed the joke, I understand the joke, and I understand what Toei was trying to hint at. However, at the same time, that doesn't take away from the fact that if you were to analyze this episode on a normal scale, it did stretch the episode out quite significantly. I mean, I even counted that the total transformation sequence and all of that dialogue early in the episode took place for about 9 minutes of Dragon Ball Super, including the intro. So, to put about 40% of the entire Super episode and just having this whole transformation sequence and all, really felt that it slowed down the pacing for the worse, and it kind of felt like a waste of time before the actual action made everything much better. And in addition to this, guys, I will have to say that this episode had poor character utilization. Now, I understand that 17 had a very good role in this episode as the silent assassin, as he was just defeating Recall, defeating Kakunsa, and, you know, just dominating in this Tournament of Power. But I feel like if you had used other characters, this episode would have been much more enriching. 17 is a stoic character who isn't as involved as the others, and I think Master Roshi, due to his training, would have been a much bigger and better part of this episode to give you an early glimpse of what his training to resist temptful women would actually be like. And you could have made much more jokes with Master Roshi in this episode, where we could have seen Master Roshi not being attracted to them because they might not look as good in their transformed states as opposed to their regular states. And when you also think about this, maybe even Android 18 could have also been more interesting in this episode too, seeing that she could have been a female fighting against all of these other Universal characters. And looking at the fact that Android 18 is very sarcastic, Android 18 is a character who always looks down at her opponents, her insults would have been much better in fighting against these opponents to actually piss them off and make the fighting much more intense. So honestly, I do think that they could have used better characters to fight against Ribrianne's crew than just Android 17, and I also think 18 being wasted and doing nothing wasn't good for the episode at all. It's always fun to see 17 and 18 fighting together. And if I were to mention something else about this episode, guys, that really got annoying, it would have to be the love theme. Now, I understand that the love theme is what this episode is supposed to be about, don't get me wrong. However, I do think that the over-repetition from Hellas, the god of destruction, really made this episode feel old at some point. It's like, we get it from the energy heart attacks, we get it from the way that they act with their transformations, we understand that this is a love universe. However, you don't have to keep reiterating it to the audience over and over again with pointless dialogue, because we get the picture. And I do think one of the best parts of Hellas's dialogue was when she was actually explaining how Ribrianne, Kakunsa, and Rozie actually fight in this episode. I thought that was great, seeing how she was analyzing their techniques and their attacks and seeing how they were comparing against their opponents. That was some of the best dialogue that Hellas had. And I think if there was one peak part of this episode where the love just got over the top, it would have to be the scene where Recall saved Kakunsa while Kakunsa was flying out of the ring, and we saw them hugging each other and having that big heart around them, and it's like, okay guys, this is going a little too far. I understand this is what you're aiming for, but it's like, we get it. You don't have to make these two characters feel like they're so in love when we understand that just by the way they fight. And I understand this is a different theme for Dragon Ball, but at this point it went a little too far, even for a joke. I think repetition has a breaking point. But when we move on to the discussion part of this episode, guys, here's a little bit of a popularity poll. So, from what we've seen so far out of Ribrianne, Rozie, and Kakunsa, now that Kakunsa's now gone, who is actually your most favorite member of this Universe 2 trio? In my honest opinion, I had the most interest in watching Kakunsa because I think that having that whole beast-like mentality actually made the episode way more entertaining when she was fighting against Android 17. So my vote would actually go to Kakunsa, and I actually think she looks the most normal when she transforms, as opposed to Ribrianne, who explodes in weight, and as opposed to Rozie, who just looks like a weird mini Teletubby. However, when we move on to the episode 103 preview, we got some interesting things to say here. So, we see Gohan fighting against Botamo, which makes me wonder what happened to Magetta, as Botamo was pretty much sitting on Magetta's back and they were fighting together throughout the Tournament of Power as a duo. And if Gohan and Piccolo are going to be fighting with remains of 3 fighters from Universe 10, this definitely means that Universe 10 is going to be on the hot seat to be erased next. And last but not least, guys, the number one thing we should look forward to is dealing with Hit and Dyspo. I think that this is all implying that we're going to see a Hit and Dyspo foreshadowing as to what is going to happen in the Tournament of Power that the spoilers are hinting at, but we can definitely see something dealing with these characters moving forward in the future, as they both have unique abilities that can contrast with each other going forward. So overall, guys, I would have to give this episode 3 stars and say that it was an average episode. I think it was an overly girly episode with a predominantly male audience watching it, and I can see why this episode had very mixed opinions, as it's very un-Dragon Ball-like. But from an outsider's point of view, they did execute this episode well using a different style. However, I view this episode as a one-time experiment that doesn't need to be replicated again or as often, as it can easily get old towards its viewers. But let me know what all of your thoughts are about Dragon Ball Super episode 102. So with everything else said, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always say, to have a great day, guys.